The northern flank must be reinforced. I agree. We can divert forces from the east. See to it. Time is critical. The eastern flank is vulnerable. We must reinforce it now. But sir, reserves are depleted. We risk overextension. A feint could work.
On December 19th, 1944, Eisenhower called a desperate meeting in a damp barracks at Verdun. The Germans were winning. The American lines were broken. Ike turned to George Patton and asked how long it would take to turn his entire army 90 degrees and attack north. The question hung in the cold air. Everyone in the room knew what it meant. The German offensive had created a massive bulge in the Allied lines. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne. American forces were in retreat across a 60-mile front. Patton's Third Army was 100 miles to the south, fighting a completely different battle in the Saar region. To help at Bastogne, Patton would have to disengage from combat, turn his entire army 90 degrees, march through winter storms, and attack into the strongest German offensive since D-Day.
Gentlemen, the eastern flank is vulnerable. We must fortify here. Sir, what about reserves from the north? The terrain is difficult. Proceed. Gentlemen, the eastern advance is our priority. Yes, sir. We can reinforce here. Good. Make it happen.
The other generals at Verdun looked at the map. They did the math in their heads. 2 weeks minimum, they thought. Maybe 3 if the weather stayed bad. Patton didn't hesitate. He said he could attack on the morning of December the 22nd. 3 days. The room went silent. General Omar Bradley thought Patton was grandstanding. British officers exchanged skeptical glances. Even Eisenhower seemed surprised by the confidence. But Patton wasn't bluffing. He had already prepared 3 complete attack plans. His staff had worked through the contingencies. He knew exactly which divisions would move, which roads they would use, and where they would hit the German flank. What none of the Allied commanders knew was that 50 miles away, German intelligence officers were having their own meeting.
Gentlemen, the pincer movement is set. We advance from the east at dawn. Understood, sir. What about reserves? Reserves are ready, sir. Gentlemen, the 6th Army will advance to pin the enemy here. Understood, sir. Good. The pincers close from the north.
And they were making calculations that would cost Germany the entire offensive. They were certain Patton couldn't arrive for at least 2 weeks. They were banking their entire strategy on that assumption. They were catastrophically wrong. Major General Hasso von Montefell commanded the German 5th Panzer Army. His forces were driving toward Bastogne from the north and east. He was confident the town would fall within days. Von Manteufel's intelligence staff had given him a detailed assessment of Allied capabilities. The report was clear. American reinforcements couldn't arrive in time to save Bastogne. The closest significant American force was Patton's Third Army, but Third Army was fully engaged in the Saar, 100 miles south. German intelligence estimated it would take at least 2 weeks for Patton to disengage, regroup, and mount an offensive north. Von Manteuffel studied the numbers. His staff had accounted for everything. The distance Patton would have to cover, the winter roads, the fuel requirements, the ammunition resupply, the coordination needed to turn an entire army. Hitler's orders demanded they reach Antwerp.
Gentlemen, we push here at dawn. The flanks, sir? Supply lines are stretched. They will hold. Proceed.
Von Manteuffel privately doubted that ambitious goal, but he was confident about one thing. Patton wouldn't arrive in time. He told his staff they would have the town secured before American reinforcements could arrive. It was based on solid intelligence analysis, or so they thought. The German calculation was rooted in their own doctrine. Wehrmacht units required extensive preparation for major operations. Moving an army wasn't something you did in 48 hours. It was a deliberate process that took weeks. German staff procedures demanded detailed planning. Units had to be pulled from the line in proper sequence. Supply dumps had to be repositioned. Artillery had to be moved along with the infantry. Coordination took time. The Germans assumed American forces operated the same way. They assumed Patton would need time to plan, time to coordinate, time to build up logistics. They had seen American caution before. They expected more of the same. But Patton wasn't cautious, and he had already done the planning before anyone asked. What the Germans didn't know was that Patton had been preparing for exactly this scenario since mid-December. He had watched the German buildup in the Ardennes. He had seen the intelligence reports that everyone else was dismissing. On December 12th, 4 days before the German attack began, Patton had called his staff together. He told them the Germans were going to attack through the Ardennes. When they did, Eisenhower would need Third Army to bail him out. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, agreed. Koch had been tracking German movements for weeks. He had identified the concentration of forces. He had warned of an impending offensive. Patton told his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, to prepare contingency plans. He wanted 3 different plans for turning the army north. One for attacking at Arlon, one for Luxembourg, one for Diekirch. Gay thought Patton was being paranoid. Third Army was in the middle of an offensive toward the Siegfried Line. Preparing for a completely different operation seemed like a waste of time. But he knew better than to argue with Patton. For a week, while Third Army fought in the Saar, Patton's staff worked on the contingency plans. They mapped out road networks. They calculated fuel requirements. They identified which divisions could move fastest and which would need more time. By December 18th, when the German offensive was 2 days old and the crisis was becoming clear, Patton's plans were complete. He had 3 fully developed operations ready to execute. All he needed was the order. At the Verdun meeting on December 19th, when Eisenhower asked how quickly he could attack, Patton already knew the answer. He had war-gamed it. He had the logistics worked out. He had briefed his division commanders. The morning of December 22nd, Patton said. 3 days, and he meant it. The German intelligence officers who were calculating that Patton needed 2 weeks had no idea they were dealing with a commander who had already done the work. They had no idea that American logistics could move that fast. They were about to learn. By December 20th, the situation at Bastogne was desperate. The 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division were completely surrounded. German forces had cut every road into the town. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the surrounded American forces. He had about 18,000 men, but they were running low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The weather was too bad for air resupply. Inside the perimeter, it was getting quieter. Not because the shooting stopped, but because they were running out of bullets. Every shot had to count. They were listening to the sounds of German tracks getting closer, wondering if anyone on the outside even knew they were still alive. On December 22nd, German commanders sent McAuliffe a surrender demand. The message was formal and emphasized the hopelessness of the American position. The Germans gave McAuliffe 2 hours to decide. McAuliffe's response became legendary. "Nuts," he wrote back. When the German officers asked for clarification, an American colonel explained it meant, "Go to hell." But McAuliffe's defiance didn't change the tactical reality. His men were surrounded. German artillery was pounding the town constantly. Casualties were mounting. Without relief, Bastogne would eventually fall. Von Montefil and his staff knew this. They were confident they could reduce Bastogne before American reinforcements arrived. Their intelligence still showed Patton at least 10 days away. What von Montefil didn't know was that at that exact moment, Patton's Third Army was already moving. 3 divisions, approximately 133,000 men, were disengaging from combat in the Saar and turning north. The 4th Armored Division was leading the advance. The 26th Infantry Division and supporting infantry were following. Behind them, the entire 3rd Army logistics system was pivoting to support the new operation. German reconnaissance aircraft spotted some American movement on December 20th and 21st. But the weather was terrible. Visibility was poor. The Germans couldn't get a clear picture of what was happening. Their ground intelligence reported American activity in the Arlon area about 25 miles south of Bastogne, but the reports were fragmentary. German intelligence officers concluded it was probably local repositioning, not a major offensive. They still believed Patton was in the Saar. They still believed relief was at least a week away. They were making decisions based on assumptions that were already obsolete. What Patton was attempting was unprecedented in American military operations and rare in modern warfare. He was moving an entire army, 3 divisions plus supporting artillery, engineers, and logistics, 90 degrees across a 75-mile front in the middle of winter during active combat. The logistics was staggering. 3rd Army had to move 133,000 men, 11,000 vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. They had to do it on icy roads in sub-freezing temperatures with limited daylight hours. The road network was the first problem. There were only a few good roads running north from the Saar to the Ardennes. Every road would be packed with vehicles, moving bumper to bumper for days. Patton's staff had calculated that if they used every available road, they could move 1 division every 24 hours. The 4th Armored would go first. The infantry divisions would follow in sequence. Traffic control was critical. Military police were positioned at every intersection. Officers with maps directed vehicles to their assigned routes. Any breakdown or accident would create a massive traffic jam. The weather made everything harder. Temperatures were below freezing. Roads were covered with ice and snow. Vehicles skidded and slid. Drivers fought to keep their trucks from sliding into ditches. But Patton's officers had trained for this. 3rd Army had a reputation for aggressive logistics. His quartermasters knew how to move supplies faster than any other army. His division commanders knew how to push their men hard without breaking them. The move also exposed a massive risk. Turning north meant Patton's southern flank was completely open to German counterattack. His staff warned him about the danger. Patton dismissed their concerns. He told Eisenhower the Germans should be worrying about their own flanks, not him worrying about his. On December 20th, the movement began. At 4 a.m., the first elements of the 4th Armored Division started rolling north. Behind them, an endless stream of vehicles followed. The column stretched for miles. Drivers were falling asleep at the wheel from exhaustion. Officers walked up and down the lines, physically waking men up to keep them moving. They knew if they stopped, the men in Bastogne died. So they kept driving. German reconnaissance pilots spotted parts of the movement on December 21st, but they still didn't grasp the scale. They reported increased American activity south of Luxembourg. They didn't report a full army on the march. Von Montefel's intelligence staff received the reports and dismissed them as insignificant. One officer wrote in the Daily Intelligence Summary that these were local adjustments with no major threat to their southern flank. They had no idea that the largest American operational movement of the war was happening right in front of them. They had no idea that their 2-week calculation was about to be shattered in less than 3 days. The German failure to detect Patton's movement wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of systemic intelligence failures that would cost them the entire offensive. The Luftwaffe had virtually no air reconnaissance capability by December 1944. Allied air superiority meant German planes couldn't fly during daylight. The few night reconnaissance missions provided limited information. German ground intelligence was almost as bad. The rapid advance had outrun their intelligence networks. They were operating in newly captured territory where they had no agents, no local informants, and no signal intercepts. Patton had made their job even harder. He enforced total radio silence during the entire movement. Third Army, normally generating constant radio traffic for coordination, suddenly went dark. German signal intelligence units frantically searched for the missing army. The sudden blackout of an entire American army terrified German intelligence officers who realized they had lost track of over 130,000 men. Von Manteuffel's staff had calculated Patton's arrival time based on rational assumptions about American operational tempo. Those assumptions were wrong because Patton was willing to accept risks that rational commanders avoided. He moved his divisions while they were still in contact with the enemy. He shifted his logistics system on the fly. He accepted the possibility of units getting lost or running out of fuel. He gambled that speed mattered more than perfect preparation. The Germans couldn't imagine an American general taking those risks. So when their reconnaissance reported American movement south of Luxembourg on December 21st, they interpreted it as something minor, something that fit their assumptions. By the time they realized what was actually happening, it would be too late to stop it. At 6 a.m. on December 22nd, 3 days after the Verdun meeting, Patton's Third Army attacked. The 4th Armored Division hit the German southern flank near Arlon, Luxembourg. The German units in the area were stunned. They had received no warning that a major American force was even in the region. One moment they were consolidating positions, the next they were under heavy attack from an entire armored division. The 5th Parachute Division was holding the German line south of Bastogne. They were a solid unit, but they weren't prepared for what hit them. Sherman tanks came out of the snow and fog. American artillery opened up with devastating effect. Within hours, the German defensive line was penetrated. The 4th Armored punched through and began advancing toward Bastogne, 25 miles to the north. Patton had told them to move fast, accept casualties, and reach the surrounded garrison. At von Manteuffel's headquarters, the reports started arriving around noon. Strong American armored attack near Arlon. Then multiple American divisions identified. Then enemy advance toward Bastogne. Von Manteuffel looked at the map in disbelief. He asked his intelligence chief how this was possible. Patton was supposed to be in the Tsar. The intelligence officer had no answer. The entire assessment had been wrong. Patton wasn't 10 days away. He was here. Now. And he was attacking with overwhelming force. Von Manteuffel immediately ordered reinforcements to block the American advance. But he didn't have many reserves available. Most of his forces were committed to taking Bastogne from the north or pushing west toward the Meuse River. He pulled the Panzer-Lehr Division and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division to create a blocking force south of Bastogne. These were elite units, but they had to move into position while under attack. It was a desperate improvisation. The battle south of Bastogne became a brutal slugging match. German forces fought hard to keep the Americans from reaching the surrounded garrison. The 4th Armored Division fought through village after village, taking casualties but maintaining momentum. But the Germans couldn't stop what was coming. Behind the 4th Armored, the entire Third Army was arriving. The 26th Infantry Division and supporting infantry were moving into position. Patton had brought overwhelming force. The German southern flank was collapsing. On December 23rd, von Manteufel sent an urgent message to Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B. The message was blunt. Patton had attacked their southern flank with at least 3 divisions. Their intelligence estimates had been catastrophically wrong. Model was furious. His entire offensive depended on having time to capture Bastogne and push to the Meuse before American reinforcements arrived. If Patton was already attacking in force, the timeline was destroyed. Model called von Manteuffel and demanded an explanation. How had an entire American army moved 100 miles without being detected? How had intelligence missed this? Von Manteuffel had no good answer. He said they had moved faster than anyone believed possible. Their calculations had assumed normal American operational tempo. Patton was not operating normally. What von Manteuffel didn't say, but understood completely, was that this meant the German offensive was probably doomed. If Patton could relieve Bastogne, the entire German salient would be vulnerable to counterattack from the south. Model ordered von Manteuffel to hold Bastogne at all costs. They needed that town, Model said. If Bastogne held and Patton linked up with the garrison, they would lose their best roads west. The offensive would stall. But giving the order and executing it were different things. Von Manteuffel was now fighting on 2 fronts. His forces around Bastogne were fighting the 101st Airborne inside the town while simultaneously trying to block Patton's advance from the south. The German forces were being stretched thin. Units that had been attacking were pulled back to defense. Reserves that were supposed to continue the westward drive were redirected to stop Patton. The entire operational plan was unraveling. The German offensive had been predicated on speed and momentum. Take Bastogne quickly, reach the Meuse, split the Allied forces before they could react. But Patton had reacted faster than anyone thought possible. The Germans were still dangerous. They had strong forces and good commanders. But they had lost the initiative. They were reacting to Patton instead of executing their plan. In mobile warfare, that was usually fatal. At 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division entered Bastogne. The siege was broken. The surrounded garrison was relieved. Patton had done what the Germans said was impossible. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the lead Sherman tank Cobra King, made contact with the 101st Airborne. His battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, followed close behind. The 37th Tank Battalion had fought through 4 days of brutal combat, covering the 25 miles from Arlon to Bastogne against determined German resistance. But they had made it. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne had held despite being outnumbered and surrounded. When the first Sherman tanks appeared, soldiers came out of their positions cheering. Some were crying. They had endured a week of hell and survived. When the hatch of Cobra King opened, there wasn't a formal salute. Just exhausted men shaking hands in the snow. The 101st had held the line, but seeing that white star on the side of a Sherman tank was the first time in a week they knew they were going home. General McAuliffe met with the relief column commanders shortly after their arrival. The surrounded garrison could finally be resupplied and reinforced. The relief of Bastogne was militarily significant, but it was also symbolically devastating to the Germans. They had gambled everything on a rapid breakthrough before American reserves could arrive. Patton had shattered that timeline. Von Manteuffel received word of the breakthrough at his headquarters. He immediately understood what it meant. He told his staff the offensive was over. They couldn't take Bastogne now. They couldn't push to the Meuse. They'd be lucky to hold what they had. His chief of staff protested that they still had strong forces and could continue attacking westward. Von Manteuffel shook his head. With Patton attacking their southern flank and Bastogne still in American hands, they were in a salient now, not a breakthrough. Continuing west would only surround them. Model, at Army Group headquarters, still wanted to continue the offensive, but he was receiving similar assessments from other commanders. The momentum was gone. The surprise was lost. Allied reinforcements were arriving from every direction. On December 27, Hitler ordered the offensive to continue. The field commanders knew it was hopeless, but they had no choice. They would attack until they couldn't attack anymore. But everyone understood the truth. Patton had stopped the German offensive. He had done it in 3 days when the Germans had calculated he needed 2 weeks. The impossibility had become reality, and the German army was about to pay the price. Patton believed the relief of Bastogne vindicated his entire approach to warfare. He had advocated for speed and aggression throughout his career. The operation proved his methods worked. Patton told his staff after the battle that the key to mobile warfare was not having overwhelming force. The key was moving faster than the enemy could react. If you could get inside his decision cycle, you won regardless of relative force ratios. This was the principle that German intelligence had failed to account for. They had calculated force ratios and movement speeds. They had analyzed logistics and terrain, but they had not accounted for decision-making speed. Patton made decisions faster than German commanders. He accepted risks they wouldn't accept. He moved before they thought movement was possible. This tempo advantage was more important than numerical superiority. In a January 1945 press conference, a reporter asked Patton how he had moved so quickly. Patton's answer was revealing. They didn't move quickly, he said. They moved normally. Everyone else moved too slowly. That statement captured the fundamental difference in military culture. What looked impossible to the Germans was normal operating procedure for Patton. What looked risky to cautious commanders was acceptable risk to Patton. The relief of Bastogne became one of Patton's signature achievements. It was featured prominently in newspaper coverage. It reinforced his reputation as America's most aggressive and effective combat commander. But Patton himself was already focused on the next operation. He wrote in his diary on December 29th that Bastogne was a necessary diversion. Now they needed to get back on the offensive and drive into Germany. The war wouldn't be won by defensive victories. That aggressive mindset, the constant focus on the next attack, the next advance, the next objective, was what made Patton different. And it was what the Germans had failed to anticipate when they calculated his arrival time. Military historians consistently identify the relief of Bastogne as one of the greatest logistical achievements of World War II. It is studied in staff colleges today not just as history, but as the ultimate example of rapid redeployment. What makes the operation legendary is that it succeeded precisely because Patton violated conventional military wisdom. He moved forces while in contact with the enemy. He prioritized speed over preparation. He accepted risks that doctrine warned against. The Germans were right that the operation was extremely risky, but they were wrong that it was impossible. The difference matters. Impossible means it cannot be done. Extremely risky means it might succeed if you have the right leader. Patton bet on his preparation, his logistics, and his troops. The bet paid off. Bastogne was relieved. The German offensive failed, and the German intelligence officers who calculated 2 weeks learned the hard way that sometimes the impossible only takes 3 days, if you have an army, a mission, and the will to win.